Are we only half alive? Embers drifting in the night, looking, wandering all the time. We seek a kingdom. This is not my home. This skin and bone, the daylight will reconcile the dead and the gone. Let the kingdom come.
I'm Robert Beatty with the How Free Do You Want to Be series. Thank you for joining us, my friends. This is going to be a life-changing venture for you. If you were diagnosed with a life-threatening disease today, would you just accept the idea that you must live with the diagnosis? Or would you research and educate yourself, get a second opinion, seek treatment? Would you seek a cure? Well, then why is addiction and mental illness any different? And why would you believe that they're not curable? Everyone's burdens in life are different. What's a life crisis for one person, another one might call nothing at all. And others experience more trauma, anxiety, depression, and suffering, health issues than anyone could ever imagine. We all have our crosses to bear, as they like to say. And maybe what separates us is the weight and the size of it and how far up a hill we've got to haul it. Well, these crosses involve mental illnesses of one type or another, but these issues can be healed. In fact, they can be cured. And the truth is, we're all addicted to something. It might not be alcohol or drugs. That could be sex, could be gambling, pornography, playing video games, working out, eating, shopping, hoarding, cleaning, even pain and suffering. Well, that list goes on ad infinitum. In 1939, the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous was published, and the world started to learn about the success and the methods of what the authors of that book called the 12 Steps. The 12 Steps, as they were written, were hard to understand. They were confusing, mostly because of the era in which they were written. The program has worked for millions and millions of men and women since 1939. It worked for me too. It worked for a man who led me through these steps and the man that led him through that. It worked for all of us, and it'll work for you too. This program answers the following questions very clearly. Is there a cure for addiction? Is there a cure for depression and anxiety? Is there a cure for mental health disorders in general? Does God exist? Is a higher power there? Do prayers get answered? And what does it take to have a spiritual awakening to create a psychic change or a change in the way that we think? The steps found in this program can be used to overcome just about anything in your life once you understand them. It's a simple, proven plan of action found within them, and a promise that will set you free. Free from addiction, free from suffering, free from the struggles of your life. When you complete the steps as they're outlined in this program, you're going to find a few things: serenity, freedom, and peace, as millions and millions of men and women before you have. This series will guide you through the same spiritual awakening that I had. It will cause a psychic change within you, a change in the way that you think. I want to give you a brief history of myself before we begin. I have personal knowledge of the pain, suffering, and destruction caused by addictions and mental illness. I have my own story, a story of spiritual awakening, redemption, and a journey to full recovery from mental illness, from alcoholism and addiction. And we'll cover that later in this series. I ask you to just be willing to have an open mind and an open heart. And if you do this, I promise you one thing. I promise you that this program will work for you, and it will change your life. I'd like to give you a history on mental health and addiction. Mental health issues were recorded as far back as 1900 BC. Around 400 BC, a Greek physician named Hippocrates identified the different levels of mental and physical health, and for the first time in history, he endeavored to separate religion from superstition, from health and well-being. And he also believed that mental illness was something that you should be ashamed of, or you must be punished for. Thankfully, a lot has changed since then. Alcoholism and addiction were recorded as far back as 7000 BC, when fermented beverages were developed in China, along with many other mind-altering substances, in fact. In our society, alcohol and drugs have always been the root of illegal activities, problems, and several mental health disorders. The Volstead Act, or Prohibition Act, passed by the United States Congress in 1919. It made the distillation, sale, distribution, and transportation of alcohol illegal, but not its consumption. And for the next 13 years, Americans proved that even the law couldn't keep them away from a drink. Not only would they continue to use alcohol, but they would profit from it via the black market. So despite attempts by authorities to control alcohol, the problem was out of control. As one establishment was raided, closed down, another one would pop up in its place. The illegal use of alcohol fueled gangsters, moonshiners, and organized crime. And to add to the growing problem, the Italian mafia started to distribute heroin and cocaine. Like alcohol, the ever-increasing issues associated with the illegal distribution of drugs eventually led to the national prohibition of cocaine with the passing of the Dangerous Drug Act of 1920. And before this, heroin was regulated by the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. That act made the sale and distribution of heroin legal for medical purposes only with a doctor's prescription. But by 1924, new laws made heroin an illegal substance as well. During Prohibition, medical doctors even began to prescribe alcohol as a way around Prohibition. And at one time, over 1 million gallons of alcohol were prescribed per year. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, approximately 15 to 20 million Americans suffered from alcoholism. Wow. In our history, there's always been people across the spectrum, those that could drink moderately, those that could take it or leave it, the hard drinkers, and those that just can't stop no matter what. Medical professionals and scientists have never really been sure about the cause of alcoholism or addiction for that matter, but we have identified specific things that lead to it, such as family history and drinking for long periods of time, mental health, anxiety, depression, social acceptance, just to name a few. However, not everyone with these issues becomes an alcoholic. In the past, alcoholism and addiction were perceived as character flaws, a conscious decision by someone with no morals, no honesty, and control by normal society standards. And so sufferers were stigmatized. Thankfully, all of that has changed over the years, and particularly since the medical profession came forward years ago and publicly declared alcoholism and addiction as diseases. Since then, treatment has evolved substantially. Alcoholism rehabilitation started as early as 1750, when groups of Native Americans formed society circles to help members of their community stay sober. More than 100 years later, in 1879, there was a doctor named Leslie Keeley who labeled drunkenness a legitimate medical disease, and he claimed he could cure it with injections of biochloride of gold and chlorine. Keeley's operations may have been the earliest makings of what we now know as residential inpatient treatment centers. However, in the history of alcoholism, two individuals stand out: Bill Wilson, Bill W., and Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, or Dr. Bob. They came together in 1935 to form what is now known as Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA. And they were passionate about this cause because they were both desperate to stop drinking. Shortly after Bill W. became sober, he helped Dr. Bob stop drinking too. And soon afterward, Alcoholics Anonymous was formed. Their initial plan was to work with alcoholics at the Akron City, Ohio hospital. And at first, the only people in the group were Dr. Bob, Bill W., and a mutual friend named Ebby T., or Ebby Thatcher. These early pioneers also began writing a guidebook about how to become sober. In 1939, they published their first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous. Before this time, hospitalization and mental wards were the only answer. Many doctors advertised cures, but there weren't any detox centers or treatment centers. Just these peddlers of elixirs and potions of liquid cocaine and similar preparations. Today, new treatment centers spring up all over the world every day. They offer treatment for alcohol, for drugs, every form of addiction, including sex, pornography, eating disorders, and mental health issues. These advances in treatment show that alcoholism and addiction have become acceptable diseases and not an indictment of character for its sufferers. In those early days, there were very few people that had ever read this book called The 12 Steps. The early AA groups typically shared the message of hope by taking another alcoholic through the 12 steps in 1 to 2 days with 4 to 5 one-hour sessions. And most of the time they would require that all newcomers complete the 12 steps before introducing them to a regular meeting. Alcoholics Anonymous was the first time that I faced my own addictions and mental health issues. Gosh, I remember attending my first meeting and being at the first one and reading this book for the first time, and it was so confusing. I think I was like a deer in the headlights, full of fear. I was overwhelmed because I had never been through anything like the 12 steps before. I often wonder what it might be like for people attending their first meeting of AA or Narcotics Anonymous if they'd already completed the 12 steps before attending their first meeting. If they had already made prayer and meditation a daily part of their lives, if they'd already experienced spiritual awakening, a psychic change, if they had a genuine connection to a higher power or God. During the 1940s, the AA program experienced this huge success rate of around 75 to 80% of all newcomers remained sober and free. Today, that number is much, much lower. Published studies show today that the success rate is somewhere between 5 and 10%, maybe only 2% to 3%, depending on what state you live in. For the duration of this series, I'll be referring to the 12 steps as they were written in Alcoholics Anonymous that was designed to lead to a spiritual awakening and a psychic change. I would prefer to call them proposals or suggestions or experiences because the word steps kind of sounds like a test that you must pass to find sobriety and freedom. However, for simplicity, I'm going to use the word steps as it's simpler. But it's not about a pass or fail. Instead, I would like to encourage you to think of the 12 steps as an experience that you and I will have together, just like a mentor did with me and just like they did in the 1940s. Now, I want to be clear, this approach may not reflect AA as you know it today. This series is a guide that will help you understand the simplistic principles that were taught in the 1930s by the founding fathers of a program they called Alcoholics Anonymous, and the principles that had tremendous power and tremendous success. Also, please understand that this series is not just about alcoholism and addiction. We're going to be talking about alcoholism and addiction in general. However, the principles can be applied to every addiction, mental health issue that there is. And they can also be applied to overcome just about every problem in life. Eating disorders, smoking, sexual addictions, pornography, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, mental disorders, even personal relationship issues. Every troubling issue in your life can be overcome through the promises found within these 12 steps and through the principles found and the power. The spiritual principles of the 12 steps as they were taught in the 1940s and 50s has worked for countless men and women who have found sobriety in their teachings. It worked for me, it worked for the mentors who taught me these principles, and it'll work for you too. Why fix something that isn't broken? And why change something that works? Before going through these steps with a mentor who took this original approach, I had been through 7 different treatment programs without success, and each one of them with the same result. I would leave and I would always drink and use the same day that I returned home. Sometimes on my way home. Nothing changed. Nothing stopped me from drinking and using drugs, not even jail. Until one day, a mentor took me through these 12 steps just as they were taught in the 1940s, verbatim. Doing the step work freed me from the compulsions and the cravings to use alcohol and drugs. Now, I don't wish this series to be interpreted as a guidebook for Alcoholics Anonymous, nor do I want to stand on a soapbox and tell you there's only one way to do this. But I do have a strong opinion that there's only one true path to sobriety, and it's a spiritual one, whatever that means to you and whatever you call it. But I'm certainly not here to argue or debate. I'm just simply here to tell you that if you approach these 12 steps with an open mind and an open heart, you're going to experience something you've never had in your life. You're going to discover things about yourself that you probably didn't even know. Get a highlighter. We're going to be going over a lot of stuff. Again, just to be clear, you cannot go through these steps too quickly. You can, however, go through them too slowly. Why? Because the process of this and these suggestions hold within them specific promises, statements of hope that lead to a spiritual awakening, which will cause a psychic change or the change in the way that you think. These steps have real power, and if you're sick like I was and you're here, you need the power found within them, and you need it right now. Many times in my journey to sobriety, I heard things like, "Hey, Cord, you're too early in sobriety to be doing anything except your first step. The fourth and fifth steps are the hardest ones that you'll ever do in your life. It's going to take you a long time to get through them, maybe years. Hey, you shouldn't be working on your fourth and fifth steps for 6 to 12 months. You shouldn't mentor anyone unless you've had at least a year of continuous sobriety. The only way you'll ever be sober is if you get a big book, get a mentor, attend an AA meeting every day, and ask God to keep you sober one day at a time." Are you kidding me? There wouldn't be any way for me to stay sober if I thought that the only way that I could stay sober is to attend a meeting every day of my life. If I had to call a mentor every day and receive instructions about what to do next, if I had to ask God to keep me sober one day at a time or just today, are you kidding me? What about asking God to keep me sober for the rest of my life? I couldn't live this kind of existence. I'd be drinking before the sundown to make it through a day like that. As I said before, you may have already been through the 12 steps, and you may be working through them again, and you just can't stay sober. Or maybe, if you're like me and you're a chronic relapser, you could relate to that. And you need the promises and the power found within these 12 steps, and you need them right now. As I've already described, the pioneer of the fundamentals of this program, Bill W., was only a few days sober when he shared a message of hope with someone else for the first time. And he typically took people through the 12 steps in as little as 2 days. Just imagine what would have happened to Bill's program if he would have waited 6 months or a year. Alcoholics Anonymous wouldn't have gone anywhere. I'd like to give you a few words on mentorship. Early on, I met a man named Big John. He was 6'5" and probably 300 pounds of solid muscle. I don't think I'd ever been around a larger man in my whole life, and I'll never forget the first time I met him. He walked into an AA meeting. He ducked under the door coming in. He didn't even sit down before he commanded in a big booming voice, "My name is John, and I'm a real alcoholic. And I did my first step serving 21 years at San Quentin Penitentiary. And if any of you think you've had it worse than me, come up and see me after the meeting and I'll explain a few things to you." That's not exactly what he said. There was a lot of vulgarities and explicits involved in that. After his dramatic entrance and his announcement, he sat down directly in front of me at the table and he stared straight through me with the coldest, hardest, steely red eyes I had ever seen in my life. He looked like the brawny tall guy with his arms folded. He was spooky, and I was impressed. So when John got up to go to the bathroom, I turned to my friend who was sitting next to me, and I said, "Hey, that's my guy. That's going to be my mentor." And my friend said, "That's not a good idea. Well, John, he's pretty rough around the edges." And I said, "Well, he's not going to get my goat." And my friend said, "Really? I think he just rode in on your goat." So after the meeting, I approached John and I asked him if he would help me. And he asked me if I'd have been through the first step yet. And I said yes. In fact, I've been through all 12 steps a few times. Well, then he asked me a question. He said, "How have you managed to stay sober if you've been through these 12 steps?" And I told him, "Well, I slipped a few times." And then he said, "There's no such thing as a slip-up, brother. There's only a conscious, well-thought-out decision to drink or use." Then John did something that absolutely blew me away, something that no one had done before. He grabbed my big book out of my hand, he turned to page 59, and he handed it back to me. He told me to read the first step in first person, in my own words. And I read, "I admit that I'm powerless over alcohol and that my life has become unmanageable." He said, "What does that mean to you?" And I said, "Well, that I'm powerless. So when I have a drink of alcohol or I use drugs, I crave more and I can't stop. I'm out of control no matter what. I just can't stop." And he said, "You know what, Cord, you can't be more wrong about that." He said, "You told me that you'd done your first step. And when I asked you how you managed to stay sober, you said you slipped a few times. The key words here, Cord, are the ones you skipped over: powerless and unmanageable. And if you're managing to stay sober one day at a time and you're having periods of sobriety, if you're one of those guys that thinks God isn't real or can't hear you, if you continue to relapse over and over again, then you haven't completed a first step as you just told me you have. And you certainly have never been through the 12 steps. You don't recognize that you have no power, that the alcohol and the drugs are managing you, that your life is really a three-ring shit show. Does that sound familiar to you? Wow, was that me. My life was a complete disaster, an unmanageable blob of chaos. I was going through my life like a big old wrecking ball, just bouncing and smashing my way from one disaster to the next. Just obliterating every opportunity and every relationship, and I certainly couldn't get out of my own way. I think that he was the first guy that helped me truly understand what I was really dealing with. That my issue was a disease and a form of mental illness. I'm grateful to him and the advice that he's given me over the years. Big John and others like him that I've worked with, I consider my friends and my mentors. And I often call on them for discussions of insight and issues that are going on in my life or someone that I'm working with. This is what the step process is all about. It's one alcoholic addict working with another, right? Two alcoholics and addicts come together, God shows up, and recovery happens. And one day I found a guy who knew this process and these steps better than anyone I had ever met. I assumed he'd studied them for years, that maybe he'd read every book on the subject or taught workshops, that he'd attended every 12-step meeting that he could find, and he had more knowledge than anyone I'd ever met. And I quickly realized that this man had clearly had a spiritual awakening. He changed his thinking through the process. He clearly had recovered from the disease of addiction. And I asked him, "How did you acquire your knowledge of the 12 steps? Was it through a spiritual awakening? Was it through a change in the way that you think?" And he quickly said, "Nope. I had a mentor that took me through these steps in the same process in the same way that they did in the 1940s. He said, "You know what? There's only one true path to sobriety, and it's a spiritual one that creates a psychic change in you." Over time, people have come up with their own interpretation in meetings about the 12 steps. And men, especially, develop a godlike complex of their own versions of the 12 steps and how they should be taught. I've heard things like maybe we should have a 13th step. But why change something that's so simple? Why fix something that isn't broken? Why change something that works, right? There is great importance in doing these steps and these things exactly like they were done and that they were taught in the 1940s and 50s by great men like Bill W., by Dr. Bob, Ebbie T., and the early pioneers of the AA movement, because within these 12 steps, there are specific promises to be gained that will take you to a life free from addiction. There's power found within these, and it will set you free. You see, I came to sobriety kicking and screaming. I came with a big ego, and I thought I was smarter than every one of you. I was better than you, and I was convinced that I wasn't an alcoholic or an addict like you. I was the guy walking in late to every meeting that I ever went to, just to make sure that you knew that I had arrived. I was the one sitting in the back of the meeting, usually leaving early to make sure you knew that I really didn't need to be here. I was the guy pushing all my views on everyone about the 12 steps and what they were about. I had a lot of opinions that I wanted you to hear, and I was going to make sure that you heard every single one of them. And I had it all figured out, and I didn't need anyone's help, especially yours. I was the guy in the meeting that was standing on my soapbox every chance I had to share, pontificating about experiences that I had never had in my life because I hadn't completed these steps myself. And I was telling you someone else's experiences, something else I had heard in another meeting. I had opinions on the steps that were better than everyone else's because I thought I was smarter than you. And I didn't need a mentor, and I didn't need to work through these steps like everyone else had to, and I had my whole life well under control. The only time I ever had any humility was on those days where I had to crawl to the front of a room with my head down and pick up another 24-hour chip and a hug after a huge relapse. But as soon as I would hear all of you applaud me for my stupidity and say, "Attaboy, Cord, way to go," I was right back to the same old egotistical, narcissistic me. Do it all over again. Yeah, I know the 12 steps. I've had a spiritual awakening. I've done the 4th step. Just ask me. I'm going to tell you about it. I'll tell you about amends. I'll tell you all about that. I know God. I know Him. You know, you want my opinion? Well, maybe I'm going to give it to you anyway. Then I'd relapse a few weeks later and start the whole process over again. I was hopelessly pathetic. You know, there was a period of my time before I got sober that I didn't have a home. I didn't have a job. I had lost everything. I was living on the streets. I didn't have a car. I was in hotel rooms, panhandling. I didn't have anything. I did everything and anything I could to survive, include begging for enough money to get a bottle and a night in a hotel. No one wanted to be anyone near me. I was like a lightning rod for bad luck. And I couldn't relate to any one of those people in those 12-step meetings. I had nothing. I wasn't like them. The point is that because of the 12 steps and the power and promises found within them, my life began to change, just like yours is going to. For the purpose of this series, I'm going to be referring to alcoholism because it's primarily who I am. I'm a grateful, recovered alcoholic addict. However, in my opinion, the 12 steps apply to every addiction. It can be used in daily life as a method to overcoming just about anything that's messing up your life. I've also used the 12 steps to help me through personal relationships, through depression, through mental illnesses, even smoking. Gosh, for years, probably 25 years, I smoked cigarettes. Someone once said to me, "You know what, you're the cigarettes doing the smoking, you're just the sucker behind it." It's true. I never really understood why I smoked, except I loved to smoke. I loved it. I hated the smell and the hassle of finding a place to smoke and the cost of it, but I loved to smoke a cigarette. There's still one issue that I do have, though. It's called chocolate, but we're going to save that for later. The point is that you can use these steps to overcome just about anything in your life once you understand them. I personally believe that the steps must have been divinely given to the authors who wrote them, because there's a simple, proven plan of action found within them that will set you free. The promises and the power found within them will free you from addiction, free you from struggles that you go through in your life on this earth. If you complete these 12 steps as they're outlined in the following series, I promise you that you'll find serenity. You'll find freedom, you'll find peace, as millions and millions and countless people have found before you. I believe that all addictions are a disease and a form of mental disorder. I repeat, it doesn't matter whether you suffer from addiction to alcohol, anxiety, depression, gambling, adrenaline, cigarettes, compulsive hoarding. They're all addictive mental disorders and behaviors that can be cured through the use of the 12 steps. Thank you for spending some time with me today, friends, as we introduce the series of 15 promises. We'll start with step 1 in the next series. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay sober, and God bless.
Are we only half alive? Embers drifting in the night, looking, wandering all the time. We seek the kingdom. This is not my home. This skin and bone. The daylight will reconcile the dead and the gone. Let